we're experiencing, late stage capitalism and late stage democracy right now. We're sort of stuck in this political divide that seems intractable. And, when these things happen throughout civilization, the way that you solve these problems is by returning to the roots and by starting small, by using these new technologies and trying to build new bottom-up structures. And so that's what we're trying to do with Network Cities is take a bunch of new shots on goal and see how we can use this new set of coordination technologies to try to build something, more resilient and sustainable.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome. Today's conversation is with John Hillis, founder and caretaker of Cabin. John is a smart and committed founder with an accomplished background in the tech space. In today's discussion, John goes into what is Cabin, how does it work, and what have been some of the early learnings so far. John calls Cabin a network city, and so I ask him to define and unpack that further. We discuss the historical trends of centralization and decentralization, observations from Web 2 and the gig economy, and how those trends have enabled the rise of what John refers to as blockchain leviathans. And finally, I asked John a bit more about the roadmap and North Star for Cabin moving forward in the future. This conversation was recorded in March 2023 at ETH Denver. I do think Cabin is going to be a project we hear more from in the future and worth keeping an eye on. I hope you get value out of this discussion with John Hillis. Today we're here with John Hillis, who is the co-founder and caretaker of Cabin. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for saying yes to this invitation on a whim. We're here at ETH Denver. Yeah. How's your conference been?
It's been great. It's always good to come back to ETH Denver in particular because I think it has like the sort of broadest beating heart of the Web3 community that shows up here. And, seeing how that changes across different market cycles and, over time, it's just always good to return to and remember how big and diverse and different, the corners of this ecosystem are, and they all show up here.
Right. So help me understand, what is Cabin?
Yeah, Cabin is building a network city. So Network City is a city that's not all in one place. And we believe that cities are built around the dominant technology of an era. For the past century, that was cars. For the next century, we think that's going to be the internet and blockchains. And so we're building physical neighborhoods that are spread out all over the world that operate as co-living hubs in nature for independent online creators.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot there. Co-living hubs inside of nature, you said?
Yeah. So we try to optimize for places that are within an hour of a major airport, have over 100 megabit per second internet, and have nature out the front door. And we are building a network of these places so that people can, live with community, but have the flexibility to do it all over the world.
Got it. So it's really kind of this theme of digital nomadism, but applied to now more physical infrastructure that can help convene and create new layers of shared context?
Yeah, I think that's right. There are some, existing co-living networks out there, but they're typically organized as corporations that are sort of like creating these very bland experiences. And what we want to build is permanent places built around community first and foremost, and have these hubs be independently operated local places that have their own deep culture, but also have cross-pollination across the network.
Fascinating. So you wrote an essay, I guess, somewhat at the outset of this project, called A Brief History of Decentralized Cities and Centralized States, which I highly recommend and we'll include in the show notes. But can you walk us through a bit of that high-level thesis and the historical context?
Sure. So, the basic idea is just that human civilization advances when we have new coordination technologies, and it typically follows a cycle of centralization and decentralization that we've seen play out over time. And that essay in particular maps how it's played out through the four major historical eras of Western civilization. There's actually a lot of other great non-Western examples, but we can stick to that context for now, just because people tend to know those stories a little bit better. If you go back to the kind of emergence of civilization in ancient river valleys, what they were doing was trying to figure out how to coordinate to solve irrigation, both for agricultural production, but also to avoid floods. By coming together and figuring out these kind of local bottom-up structures for how to do irrigation, they started then building neighborhoods and villages and eventually cities. And that sort of bottom-up, decentralized approach to city building played out again over kind of each of the major historical periods. So you see these coordination technologies play out in each of these phases. And so, the first phase you have river civilizations, and then you start to get, economies of scale in these cities, which then leads to centralization, and then eventually leads to, these sort of large-scale systems that collapse in on themselves because they've become too centralized, and then the whole cycle starts over. So, the ancient river civilizations, all of a sudden you've got now leaders coming in and kind of re-centralizing, starting to build pyramids, starting to literal pyramid schemes, and then eventually the whole thing kind of overstretches its resources, collapses, and then you need some, new coordination technology that helps kick off the next cycle. So then, the next one after that, you have Greek city-states, which come out of the Phoenicians, come up with the phonetic alphabet. Big unlock of a new coordination technology, allows people to start writing some epic poetry and building these new political structures, and then eventually that turns into the Roman Empire and overstretches, same thing, uses resources, collapses. You go on to the next cycle, and so we believe that we're entering a new one of these cycles, and that we're experiencing late stage capitalism and late stage democracy right now, and we're sort of stuck in this political divide that seems intractable. And when these things happen throughout civilization, the way that you solve these problems is by returning to the roots and by starting small, by using these new technologies and trying to build new bottom-up structures. And so that's what we're trying to do with Network Cities is take a bunch of new shots on goal and see how we can use this new set of coordination technologies to try to build something more resilient and sustainable.
Got it. So new technology comes in, starts a new cycle, bottoms up coordination. We create these decentralized hubs and cities and city-states, and then it continues to grow, becomes more centralized. And what seems to continually happen throughout human history, or the history that we can see, is that it then collapses and, the cycle starts again.
That's right.
Yeah. And right now we're possibly at the end of a stage and beginning of another one.
Yeah, I think it certainly feels that way. I mean, if you look at, the kind of current political environment, certainly in the United States, but also across the world, we're kind of stuck in this like left-right divide. Yeah. And, you can trace the roots of that back to Hobbes and Rousseau. And we're sort of like, since the Enlightenment, we've been on this one track of political philosophy and sort of playing out the idea of nation states through the lens of that left, right, and divide, which finds its origins in the French Revolution. When they were trying to bring together Parliament and literally had the commoners on the left side and the nobles on the right side, and we're like it's just still playing this same script, you know.
Wow.
And so we think it's time to try some new scripts, and we don't have all the answers, but what we get excited about is that we have new tools to try things. When I was in college, I was got really interested in the question of collective action problems and trying to understand how people could overcome collective action problems. And there was some research that Elinor Ostrom and others had done on this that suggested that the only real way this like ever works is with small groups. But the problem is they're just like in the context of academic political science. It was like, well, you can't just go start a new country. There's not like a lot of opportunities to experiment with these things and to try new things. What we have now is a toolkit that actually allows any group of people on the internet to come together and experiment with new forms of governance in a self-sovereign way. And that's a new and exciting thing. And, we don't have the answers, but what we do have is a whole lot of people trying a whole lot of things. And, eventually, if you run an evolutionary process like that, you come out with, some new solutions to the problem.
Got it. And so you use this term network city. Help me understand that. And I've also, we hear network state emerging a lot as a concept. Similarities, differences, and distinctions.
Yeah. So we've been working on Cabin, since before the network state came out. But we certainly share some ideas with Balaji's writings on that. I think the core important part of that we agree on is the part I was just saying, which is essentially that communities can now come together and try new coordination games that can hopefully result in more resilient systems for humanity. Once you get beyond that, I think that the book itself is maybe 10%, here's what a network state is, and 90% some of Balaji's ideas about the world. And so those ideas, are not things that are necessarily what, Cabin represents or agrees with. But I think the underlying intention is that there should be lots of communities with lots of different ideas trying lots of different things.
Yeah. So is it let 1,000 flowers bloom, plurality of approaches? But we're pointing at the same general thesis, it sounds, in terms of digital coordination is enabling people to come together across geographies and new forms of human organization.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I hope we'll have a conversation with Balaji at some point as well. If you're listening, Balaji, let's talk about network states. So you've been working on this for a while. What are you learning, and what are some of the key insights? I from a distance, it looks like there's been a lot of experimentation and a high velocity of prototyping happening.
Yeah, so, we tried to start out with something very simple, which was we had a group of independent online creators who came together, we're spending some time at a cabin in the woods and wanted to figure out how to, bring more people out for these types of experiences. And so we set up this, crowd fund that allowed people to contribute to a creator residency program. In exchange for their contributions, they got a governance token where they could then vote on which creators could come out. And so it's this very simple governance mechanic, that allowed us to start experimenting with having groups of people come out and work on projects together. A lot of exciting things, happened in that period. After the crowdfund, we had some folks out there, we helped with the launch of Constitution DAO, out at the cabins, and with Own the Doge, and several of the creators who came out were working on these sort of fun projects at the sort of height of the last cycle's zeitgeist. But what we realized was that bringing creators together for this sort of stuff is great, but what's really great about it is that you get into the real world learnings, and this is part of where I think Balaji has a lot of the theory of network states, in his book. The practice of it becomes much more about, the basic stuff of human interaction.
That's
and
right.
Who does the dishes,
That's right.
And that is how you actually start to really solve coordination problems together. And where that led us to was some pretty exciting things. So one of the things that we really like doing as a community is build weeks. So people, strangers from across the internet, come out to a cabin neighborhood, and in a completely decentralized way. There's usually a build captain, there's a host, and a bunch of people show up, and we build things, physical infrastructure for our city. And that is the sort of thing that I think really accelerated our learnings about like how you get things done, because it's not just this sort of idea, that we're like all thinking about and pontificating about online. It's like, no, we're going to like build a sauna today, and then we're going to get in the sauna together and, have these bonding experiences. And so I think like, that's what I get really excited about is starting to have, people come together online and then actually manifest in the real world and do things together. If you look at like the dating pool, that's the most highly motivated group of people for finding other people. And if you look at the chart of, over the last couple decades, this is not surprising. Like, if you just talk to people who are dating, they're all on the apps, and they figured this out, that you meet people online first, where there's a huge pool, and you can sort of select into people that you think are a good fit, and then you get together in person, and that's like where you actually develop relationships.
Right. Okay. And yeah, you reminded me of, I have a colleague on the farm where I live, and he requotes this. I don't know the original source, but it was, everyone wants to get enlightened, but no one wants to do the dishes.
Exactly. Yes.
And I, having spent time in different eco-village and intentional community projects and so forth, it does seem that the first step, after you land and all the ideal visions of what is going to be created happens, then there's the dishes and the real hard work. And another stage of that, I find, is also the connection into the place and the local community and the people that are already there, right? And so how are you finding that? I mean, is it mostly only been places that are kind of in remote locations and you haven't had as much interfacing, or are you finding that the root structure of these neighborhoods is also starting to have different interactions with the surrounding communities?
Yeah, certainly. We believe in being deeply embedded in local places. We want to build, permanent neighborhoods that are very that are built directly into the place that they are, in sort of every sense of that. And so when we think about like the architecture of places, when we're literally bringing the community together to build things, with our own hands on site, we're building them directly into the exact spot, with the shade of the trees where they are, and the topology of the land where it is, and then we're trying to similarly like really incorporate into local communities, and in some of the places we are, it tends to be more remote, and so there aren't necessarily a lot of other people around. But for instance, out at Neighborhood Zero outside of Austin, Texas, we have an internet tower that we built that is pumping in gigabit internet. Turns out that's something that also all the neighbors want. So now we're providing internet to the local community, and starting to build deeper relationships with people who in some cases have been out there for generations. That piece of land is an area that's been really important to my family for generations as well. And we don't want to one of the biggest issues people have with sort of this like network state idea is like, oh, this is just like some form of neo-colonialism or something. And it doesn't have to be that. It certainly can be, but it doesn't have to be, right? It can be something that is deeply centered in the community.
Yeah, so I'd love to go further on this point, because it does strike me that this would be one of the potential unintended consequences of a maximally successful model here, of whether it's network city or network states, where there's kind of repeating patterns of neocolonialism. And I guess, especially coming from my own experience, which is to have gone off to another country, started a community, had to embed myself in that place, made a ton of mistakes, learned this, a bit the hard way as well. Some of the arguments I can imagine is, if you're not of a place, you can't really know that place deeply well. Or if you haven't spent real time there and built relationships, how can you know the seasons and the land and the people and the needs and the culture and the language and so forth? And so, yeah, I guess like a cynical, version would be, oh, we're just going to buy land in a bunch of cheap, far off, beautiful locations, plop a bunch of tiny houses in there so that the tech digital nomads can have their parties to go around and the crypto bros will descend on. And you already see it in places like Southeast Asia where digital nomads, like I've been in contexts where I'm like, I kind of wish I wasn't American right now, like it doesn't feel like the impact of tech nomads is having a positive influence in that culture, that place. So yeah, I mean, how are you thinking about this, and how do we consider this and air this conversation?
Right. So we can sort of think of like 3 different ways that you could build something like this. One way is, we're going to go like create our own special economic zone, or, plop down a city of 1 million people somewhere where there isn't one, right? And that's not what we're trying to do, right? There's another version of this that's like we're going to just have sort of what you were just describing, digital nomads who are just coming and sort of plopping into a place for a couple of weeks and having some parties and moving on. And that's also not what we're trying to do. And there's a different third thing here, which is both building these deep neighborhoods that are very locally based first and foremost, that are probably over the next 5 to 10 years increasingly built around families and education and sort of more permanent communities, but then also having a portion of folks who are not necessarily just living in one of those places, but are traveling around. And I think what you get when you have communities where you have both people who are deeply embedded in a place and live there, and then also people traveling around and sort of cross-pollinating culture across the places, is the best of both worlds. Right? They're the people who are just showing up for a month or a couple months, they are coming into a place that they have some cultural familiarity with because it rhymes with other places where they've lived, but they are coming into a place where they know that it's like they've been invited into someone's house, and when you go to someone's home, you're a guest there, and you treat it differently than if it's just like an Airbnb you rented for a weekend.
Right. Yeah, it does strike me as you're describing it. This is like an evolution on the Airbnb experience, and I think I see in my own life a yearning and desire to not just go into an Airbnb for a week, but to actually find a like-minded group or community. And if I'm going to visit a place, to also embed myself in that kind of environment, ideally surrounded by beautiful nature, ideally with people who have shared contexts.
You also talked about like, you don't know the seasons or the landscape or these sorts of things. We do aspire to know those things deeply in the places where we are. So we have different roles within our community. There are people who are builders who come out and help build the actual city. There are naturalists who come out and build regenerative practices on the land. And we think that sort of local resiliency is going to be a really important part of humanity's sort of way to solve climate change and transition into a world where we can start seeing biodiversity increasing again. And these sort of things are going to like really rely on people who do want to deeply understand a place and do want to be stewards of that place.
Sure. And so it seems like, intentional communities, eco-villages, just even within the last few decades, obviously has a long history. But something's different now about not only digitization, but blockchain, coordination tools, DAOs, tokens, et cetera. Would love to help me understand, what are you seeing in terms of these new forms of coordination? What are they making possible in the economic arrangements, and maybe when I spent some time studying eco-villages, the success rate was like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a small percentage. I mean, lots of people have tried this. Very few actually endure more than the first couple of years.
Yeah.
So, it feels like the model's somewhat broken in terms of impulse to go to a new place and start a community,
Right.
at least in the previous iterations that we've been doing. So, yeah, what are we sensing as the new tool set, and what are we learning from it so far?
Yeah. So yeah, first of all, we certainly come from a perspective that has a deep appreciation for lots of people trying lots of things before.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's easy for folks sometimes in the Web3 world to think that like
It's the
this
first
is some
time ever.
Exactly, some brand new thing.
Right,
No
right.
one's
I
ever
just had
done
an
this
idea.
before. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's obviously not true, right?
Right.
People have been coordinating for a long time. People have been living together for a long time, and people have been trying to build ways of living together for a long time. And so we come in with definitely a humility about that. And I think the funnel of people who want to do these kinds of land-based projects, and then the like you said, tiny portion of people who actually can figure out how to get there and turn it into a sustainable thing. It's a rough funnel, so what we want to do is basically just widen that funnel a little bit, right? Just make it a little bit easier for people to come together and do those things.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of layers to how we can start to play the coordination games that allow people to do that. For the past decade, we've talked a lot about cryptocurrencies. And I think we're finally starting to hopefully get past that as the only first use case for blockchains. And I think we're starting to finally realize that perhaps we went too far on the financialization, part of what blockchains can enable. What I'm very excited for, in the next few years is that we can start to use blockchains more for these coordination games. Let me give a couple examples of that. Some of the most important primitives there are identity and reputation systems. And so what you want to be able to do when you have a very small community, everybody just knows each other and has like a good sense of who people are and what they can do and these sorts of things. If you want to scale that up beyond just a couple people, it's very helpful to have ways for people to have basically reputation systems within the community that allow them to say, yeah, I know how to build things. I've helped build things over here. I can come help you build things over here. Or I've helped design regenerative systems at this property. I can come do that over here too. So that's like the base layer. Is just how do we help create these sort of reputation and identity systems that let people tap into different projects and let projects connect with different people. Beyond cryptocurrencies, what blockchains can also enable is that they can be a new type of Leviathan. A blockchain Leviathan, is basically just a way for strangers on the internet to come together and decide that they want to govern a thing and have a very simple system with a token where they can collectively govern assets or collectively make decisions together without needing some central authority to verify those decisions.
And you recently published an essay to this effect.
I did, yeah. It's called Rousseau's Breadcrumbs and the Blockchain Leviathan. And it sort of traces back some of the origins of the Enlightenment political philosophy and the ways in which our current systems are designed around the political systems that we have today are built around a set of thinking that came out of the kind of end of monarchy. And if you go back and you read Rousseau, certainly if you read Hobbes, you find that the way of thinking is like very embedded in a world in which there have to be kings still. And they're kind of trying to like sense make their way into what comes after that. And what comes after that is nation states. But the way that nation states were designed, were basically built under the assumption that you have to designed government systems that work for millions of people over big distances. And those constraints are what blockchains now allow us to get away from. We can now design new governance systems that are only dozens or hundreds of people that are participating in them. And it's a very different problem space for thinking about, sort of this small scale governance than what's come before. And it allows us to think about, new ways of small groups coordinating, which is the most effective way to overcome collective action problems.
Got it. So blockchains enable coordination at smaller scales than obviously nation states, and also less physically or geographically bound than previous forms of coordination.
I think they allow coordination and governance at much smaller scales, and also probably much bigger scales
too. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So how do we bring this all back to Cabin? And so there are these different neighborhood nodes that are independently owned, you said?
Yep.
And so then I can how do I come into the network, and then how do I get permission to go into a different place, and how are the economics structured, and where does crypto fit into this?
Right. So yeah, the Cabin neighborhoods are independently owned and operated. And over time, as we build out the network of citizens, and they build, identity and reputation by participating in things that we're doing, co-living experiences, in-person gatherings at neighborhood. They can then travel around the network and go to other neighborhoods. And some people will decide that they want to build a permanent life in one place and just be able to have the high density of culture and sort of the experience of living in a city, but while being in a much more remote location with a smaller number of people. And other people will want to travel around the network and go to different places.
So one thing I saw in the materials about this that really resonated with me is that there's kind of these shorter term engagements that can come for a week intensive or a 2-week. I guess this is what you're referring to as co-living experiments.
Right.
Or I can just help go build a sauna or a gym or something.
Yep.
And so are these the mechanisms in which we're both creating context relationships, but also reputation layers and people finding their place into where it might resonate, where they might stay longer or shorter, and so forth?
Yep, that's right. So yeah, our roles are a system by which people can earn identity and reputation through their participation in programs, and then our governance token, which is called Cabin, is what we use for collective decision making, and we use it to play lots of different games. So. We sometimes think about what we're building as a kind of IRL RPG, an in real life role playing game. So you start out by choosing your character, whether that's a naturalist or a builder, a creator, a resident, et cetera. And then we use the roles and the token and passport stamps to play different games. So, for instance, our neighborhood directory is basically just a list that is curated using the token by the community to decide what counts as part of the city limits of our city. And so people are, essentially voting on, which neighborhood should be on the list and which one shouldn't. And that's an example of like this sort of thing that we can do with the token. We also use it for these creator residencies every month. We're voting as a community on people that get to come out and have free stays and build things at the neighborhoods. And the intention is that you want as much of the decision making that like matters locally to be done locally using whatever structure people want. So like we're not trying to collectively govern who does the dishes, right? We need like each co-living community to figure that part out for themselves. But what we can do is make sure that we have like a vibe and values aligned network of these things that we're all kind of collectively participating.
Fascinating. It's such an interesting I mean, it's an ambitious problem space to be tackling. I can only imagine, just the myriad of complexities and issues that you encounter in each place, and they're different. And but it does seem like one of the fundamental challenges of our time, right? How do we? Because you're addressing a housing crisis, of affordability. You're addressing, place-based regeneration. You're addressing, people's desire to travel around and move around, and but then you're also layering on these new forms of possibility of how do we find coherence and shared interests and our communities IRL in real life, but starting from the digital context.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you look at in the United States right now, people are unhappier than they've been in at least 50 years that it's been, consistently measured. And if you try to understand like why people are unhappy, it seems like it mostly boils down to two things. One of them is people feel like their standard of living is going down and is going to get worse for their children for the future. And the second reason is because they're lonely. And so, these are the core problems that we need to solve. And it seems like, if you look at the first one, the kind of standard of living question, there's a great chart that sort of shows how the prices of things have changed over time. And most like consumer goods, certainly software and TVs and all these sorts of things have gotten massively cheaper in the past couple decades. There's only a couple things that have gotten way more expensive. Unfortunately, those things are the things that account for the basic costs of living.
Right.
It's housing, food, healthcare, education.
Yeah.
And so we're just trying to get back to the basics on those things, right? And if you look at loneliness and like why people feel so lonely, I think you can basically trace it back to the like atomic nature of current urban and suburban living, and the decline of associations and sort of institutions that are that like we're bringing people together. And there's a great book, Bowling Alone, that sort of shows that in America, all of these sort of associations, Boy Scouts and Elks Club and Sierra Club and all these things peaked in the 60s and 70s and have been declining ever since then.
Right.
If you even look at, something like Tocqueville's Democracy in America, people think like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, that these are like the things that are the bedrock of American democracy. You go back and look at, Tocqueville trying to figure out what those things are so he can bring them back to France. It's the institutions that the townships, that have like local governance in America, and it's the associations that bring people together. And so we think that if we can start to form these types of associations, particularly through co-living, and then we can start to literally build actual housing and food production and education, in the context of small groups, that we can at least take some new shots on how we might try to solve these things that have become intractable problems.
Right. I'm curious about the food production side, because one thesis that we've come to a lot in our version of this and living in New Zealand is that food is like the unifier, and it helps bring people from all sides of the political spectrum, but it's also like one of the most basic tenets of resiliency. It's also a gateway into having more of a relationship with the land and getting more ecological education embedded within the community at all ages. And so I'm curious what you're seeing in the food production side so far in any of the cabin experiments, or how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, we're still early. We have a long way to go, and while we want to build like local resiliency with this stuff, we're not trying to like completely disconnect from outside sources. We'd love to help make we'd love to make supply chains shorter, but we also are not trying to like reinvent computers from scratch, right? We want to build like local systems where it makes sense to have local production. Food is definitely a good example of that, and it's one of the things that best builds resilience. And you're right; it also is one of the best things that builds community. Sometimes we talk about and think about Cabin as a continuous traveling dinner party, that goes to different places around the world, and wherever you step into it, it feels like you're walking back into this continuous dinner party, and that really is where people most come together is breaking bread around a table.
And you've been in technology a while, and you've been part of the Web 2 wave with Instacart. You were a senior member of the team there, and I'm curious, just kind of generally lessons learned and what you're taking into this new Web3 shift, or other things that are informing your vision forward.
Yeah. So when I was at Instacart, I was the director of product for shoppers, and so I was building the tools for the gig economy. And what I learned from that, most of all, is that declining transaction costs are changing the nature of the firm. So Ronald Coase, Nature of the Firm, won a Nobel Prize in economics for this idea that the reason companies exist is because there are transaction costs. And in like a sort of theoretical, economic situation with no transaction costs, you wouldn't have companies. Everybody would just be an independent contractor. And what we're seeing is that software has completely reduced the transaction costs, of basically contracts. We went from a world where in order to work with a company, you go through a whole interview process, and you sign an employment agreement and all this stuff, to you can now pull out your phone and have units of work pop up on your phone and click one button and do them. Right? And that is a massive reduction in transaction costs. And so what we're starting to see now, the first place where this happened was the gig economy, because that was the easiest place to create these sort of simple atomic units of labor with low transaction costs. The problem is they got commodified very quickly. And so what that resulted in is a sort of race to the bottom. And so I was very excited, in the early days of the gig economy about the autonomy and independence that we could provide to independent online workers. But because it got so commodified, it became, a worse deal for them over time. And so part of what I am really excited about with DAOs and with Web3 is trying to take those same tools, but build them for a world in which we can create less commodified labor, but still give people the autonomy and freedom and flexibility that sort of work can provide.
So where to from here for Cabin? What's on your 2023 roadmap, and what are some of the bold visions for the future?
Yeah. So I think one thing that is probably most exciting about working with an online community is having a really clear North Star that we're all, aiming towards, but not trying to be too prescriptive, particularly as a leader, about exactly how we get there, and letting it be a more emergent strategy from the community. And that's a hard balance to strike, but we have a 500-year roadmap at Cabin, and part of that is, just about our desire to think long term, and part of it is about our seriousness about building a city on that kind of time horizon. But what it means is that, I have lots of thoughts and opinions about what we should be, building out at a neighborhood, or what we should be working on, on a 1 or 2 or 5 or 10-year time horizon. But I try to make sure that that's something that is not, that I'm not saying
You're not prescribing
I'm not prescribing it, right? That it's something where, the community has this shared long-term goal, and we're following the natural path to get there. And, that tends to change every 6 months. And so it operates pretty differently from how, a traditional corporate planning structure might work.
Love it. Yeah. It's another characteristic of the DAO phenomenon and the decentralization is that we're also relearning and retooling up in terms of how we plan out organizations and where they emerge to.
That's right.
Excellent. Well, I really resonate with the bottoms up approach, the start small, the being place based. The long-term vision, but also being more organic and emergent with it. And I wish you all the best on the journey. Can't wait to watch and see and hopefully visit a cabin someday soon in the future.
Yeah, come have dinner with us.
Yeah, I would love to be in this never-ending dinner party.
That's right.
Yeah. Any final words?
No, that's great.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
we'll wrap up there. Thanks again for sharing your time with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with John Hillis from Cabin. I really like this frame of Network City, as well as what he shared about getting back to the basics. Cabin just launched some new features. You can see those and learn more at cabin.city. There's a link in the show notes. Please like, share, subscribe. Let us know what you think. Leave a comment below. And you can find all of our conversations at maearth.com. That's maearth.com. I'll see you on the next one.